Greetings, class, and welcome to Week 7, CIS 4710. This is the lecture for today, and we are going to be talking about system hacking this week, Chapter 7 of your book. So, with that, I also want to point out that next week is your midterm. And it covers chapters 1 through 7, so everything up through here. You may have a question or two on labs, but not really that much. Mostly all the questions are going to come out of the book in the form of questions pertaining to chapters 1 through 7. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and dive into the lecture. I have posted the slide deck up in Week 7's material under course documents, and we're going to look at system hacking. So up to this point, we have gone through footprinting and scanning and enumeration. We've gone through this the attack planning process, and now it's time to attack. It's time to try to attack the exploits that we think are most likely to succeed. Use exploitation tools, look at password cracking, some post-exploitation tactics such as privilege escalation or persistence. So, what are exploits? And this is a test question, so you need to know what an exploit is. A vulnerability is a weakness in a system or a piece of software. So it's a documented, hey, we know this is wrong. An exploit is taking advantage of that vulnerability with a tool or a manual attack or something that's documented. That is the key word. Exploits can have multiple outcomes. It isn't always shell access. We can just dump data, for example. And exploits are also not always technical. Humans are vulnerable. Humans are exploitable. We would not have social engineering if it weren't for humans. So keep that in mind as well. So how do we find these exploits? Well, we've done a lot of that digging already. We've collected information on the systems, but how do we cross-reference it? So there are really good resources online that you can use in the form of ExploitDB, CVE Details. Those are the two sites that I like to go to the most. And I think I've shown those in previous lectures. But you can also look I think ExploitDB is cross-referenced to the National Vulnerability Database. So if you just Google National Vulnerability Database, NVD Home, this is actually set up by the government, by NIST. And you can go through everything with a CVSS score. You're starting to see more and more JSON vulnerabilities released. JSON is really problematic because a lot of cloud infrastructure runs on JSON, especially for authentication. XML vulnerability feeds are getting retired as of now. So they also have a summary of kind of the last 20 scored vulnerabilities by date. So these are the latest and greatest and newest vulnerabilities. But it's also a searchable index, and they kind of outline how everything is scored. They go through different types of calculators and how they come up with these rankings. So they've really started to open up their process in the last, I'd say about a year and a half or so, or even less, with giving more insight to vulnerabilities and how they are brought up and how they're calculated and how they determine their severity. And then you have a search engine here where you can look for a CVE, CPE, by product, or you can also, they also have some good checklists in here as well. All right, so if we want to do a vulnerability search, for example, all right, we can come in here and do a basic search or a keyword search. Let's just say we wanted to look up Eternal Blue. I'm not sure if Eternal Blue is one word or two. Hopefully it's not case sensitive. Oh, might be two words. Nope. Well, I am just striking out here today, aren't I? Blue Keep. Yeah, Blue Keep. So that's another one as well. So I got one matching result, CVE 2019-0708. This was something that was released back in May, published in May. 0708 is not the month and day, that is the number. So it's the 708th vulnerability of 2019. As you can see, it is a high vulnerability on two different scales, a critical high on two different scales. And then you can dive into it, and it gives you the current information, impacts, everything else. So they have really gotten a lot better at publishing information. And they also will show you the different software that is affected. In this case, the different types of Microsoft Windows Server and Workstation operating systems. So, getting back to lecture. All right, so locating exploits and doing cross-references and seeing what the vulnerabilities are can give you insight in how to exploit them. If a tool is out there, such as a Metasploit module, just one example, or some other third-party tool that you can run against it, or what type of SQL or cross-site script or whatever that you can use against that vulnerability. There's a lot of information that is published online. So let's talk about these tools. Many common exploitation tools. Metasploit is probably one of the most common for beginners to use. It has modules that can exploit vulnerabilities, but from my experience, the Metasploit vulnerabilities that you use are typically for denial of service, or for privilege escalation, or for command shell access, a reverse TCP session to set up an interpreter session, or a root shell. Those are few and far between, and those seem to get patched the fastest. You typically do not come across them very often in the wild. Where you can find them, if they are facing the internet proper, is through maybe a Shodan search with some additional parameters, say of your target company or your customer on a pen test from a footprinting standpoint. But maybe once in a blue moon, once in or twice in your entire career will you come across something like this. Okay, that's not patched. Not that it doesn't happen. I have had it happen. I've had it happen to me in the last few years where I've had a customer that's had this problem. It was blocked by their firewall, but I was able to get on the internal side of the network, and then I exploited everything. Payloads. So a payload is a part of the exploit. It's code that is executable that you run when you are exploiting the system. It depends on the architecture. Again, this is within Metasploit. And not all payloads are created equal, so they don't all do the same thing. They have different purposes for different tasks. All right? They have a custom payload called a interpreter, or sometimes it's called a reverse TCP shell. And this is how you can inject code into the system in order to give you a window, an access, a shell to do stuff like create users, delete users, create groups, change permissions on files or programs or applications. And it's a OS agnostic. It provides common functions regardless, so it works on both Windows and Linux similarly. So we've used Metasploit. We used it in Lab 1. We're using it in Lab 2 right now with Metasploitable. It's getting a lot better to use. It's getting more widely used out there. So we use it in Kali Linux, but Parrot OS, which is a competitor to Kali Linux, and Commando VM, which is a competitor to both, are all pen testing, hacking distributions that can be built. You can get a web interface download called Armitage from Rapid7 for Metasploit. We went through how to install that. There's still some like clunkiness with that as of the 2019 version 3.3 of Kali Linux. So there's some things that you have to go through there to kind of tweak it. Inside MSF Console, you'll search and find the different types of payloads that you can inject. You can also search for CVEs that have been identified. CVE Details has a great database which will call out which exploits there are for Metasploitable. You can set different variables within Metasploit, your remote host, your local hosts, ports that you want to open up for backdoors, etc. When all necessary variables are set in MSF Console, you can then type in exploit and it will run the code. So cracking passwords can be tedious at best. So we go through a couple of different easy platforms such as X-Hydra, GFT Hydra, John the Ripper, etc. Getting to understand how to use password crackers is really, really, really important. For your OSCP, for example, you will use a lot of cracking password steps. Now, for the most part, the cracking of passwords in the OSCP for those passwords that can be cracked are pretty easy. If you put up a standard word list or a semi-expansive word list, you will probably crack a password. But in order to crack a password, one of two things has to happen. You either need to have that password hash offline so that you can just keep, banging away at it over and over and over again, or the system that you are trying to crack cannot have any type of password policy set to where it locks you out after, X number of tries. Because the likelihood of you cracking the password in that fashion is slim to none. Rainbow tables can be much faster than password hashes because they're pre-computed, but they take up an enormous amount of disk space. And Mimikatz is a program that is done within a Metasploit module. It's typically used against Windows-based systems and older Windows-based systems at that. John the Ripper also supports a lot of different add-ons and modules in order for you to use it. It is probably one of the most common password cracking tools that is out there because it comes in just about every type of hacking distribution. So how do we get these passwords to crack them? That's a great question. If you have infiltrated a system already and you've already cracked a password, let's say that you've broken in and you have just a regular standard user. If you can dump or if you can grab the SAM file out of the operating system, then you have a chance at reversing the passwords. If you can grab the shadow or etc password file at a Linux, same question. Getting to these sources is really hard, but they can also be pulled from memory if somebody has logged in and used their account recently with Mimikatz. Mimikatz is a password hacking, cracking tool that you need to get really good at. And I'm considering putting together or scrapping one of my homeworks here in the next few weeks to use it, because the more I have used it, the more I have gotten familiar and comfortable with it, the more that I see how important it is for junior pen testing individuals and pen testers in general to know it as a tool in their toolbox. So what do we do after we have exploited? So after we have grabbed the passwords and if we've logged in with just a standard user, we've escalated our privilege from our standard user to an admin or a root account, or put our user that we have, created a user and added them into the domain or local administrators group or the root group or the sudoers group, what have you. We need to then use that platform that we have taken over as a base of operations to see what we can see. And the process, we kind of go into a loop. We look at, well, I've broken into this system. Now what networks or what access or what system does this system see that I did not previously see? And what systems do I see now that I can see on this system I've cracked into that have a different footprint? Meaning, if I can only see a handful of ports open on these systems, but I crack into this other system and then I see, you know, hundreds, dozens of additional ports that are open, I have to go back and start my enumeration process all over again from that system I'm operating from. So persistence is a big, big, big deal, because as you are working off of a system, you need to stay as quiet as possible. So you have to look for things such as daemons or agents that are running on the system that might be reporting back to a centralized log server, a Splunk box, a Snort box, what have you. You need to do some system reconnaissance to ensure that you can use the system, or if you can't immediately use the system, how do you tweak the system out or modify the system that you can use it to your advantage? Because if you are detected, the likelihood is that an administrator is going to come in there, find you, lock you out, kick you out, and incident response is going to occur and start. So you need to try and be as quiet as possible after infiltrating a system so that you can springboard to other systems. So look for other different types of information on the system: password files, text files, Word files, any type of information, intelligence gathering that you can do from the system. Interpreter allows you to get screen captures of the running desktop for proof of access, or you can get time-stamped information from different commands, such as the who am I command, or the time command, the clock command, etc. You have to show that. That's a big deal, especially to customers, because you just can't say, oh, I broke into your domain controller and, okay, I got the extra bonus for the pen test, or I did. No, you have to show proof. It's kind of one of the prices of admission in this industry. So, privilege escalation, which is a big, big part of the OSCP and the CEH as well. This is where you go from just a standard user to an elevated privilege account, whether it's a power user, root user, administrator account, what have you. It's how do I get the next step up the ladder, proverbially speaking. So it's often necessary because the accounts that you initially break into might have a weak password, but they might just be a user account. You might not have access that you want. Privilege escalation is all about getting root, getting administrator, because once you have that, you have everything. You will typically require low vulnerability that will result in administrator access. It could be a low or a medium vulnerability, because the critical and high vulnerabilities typically take place out of band, and the medium vulnerabilities can take place in band. Keep in mind that all processes run with the security context of the user that owns that process. So if I can become that user, I can then own that process. Okay, so to summarize Chapter 7, system hacking, exploits take advantage of weaknesses in software and their vulnerabilities. We need to look at outside vulnerability databases like db.org, CVE details, the NIST NVDB. Start getting used to Metasploit. It's a common exploit framework. It's updated quite often by Rapid7. It has a lot of different modules that you can use for vulnerabilities. Know that there are other software distributions out there that you can use for hacking, such as Parrot OS or Commando, which runs on a package that you can install on Windows. Password cracking is a common tactic used for gaining access to a system, and post-exploitation is all about being quiet, priv-esque, password grabbing, internal reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, and staying very, very quiet. It reminds me of the old Warner Brothers cartoons of Elmer Fudd and Bugs Bunny. I can't do a good Elmer Fudd, but he always used to say, "Be very, very, very quiet. I'm hunting rabbits." And so that's something you kids can YouTube if you like. A little bit of a tidbit of information from my childhood back in the 70s and 80s. Anyway. The assignment slide here, this is not an assignment, but if you want to look into it first for your own benefit, you're more than welcome to. Going back to syllabus, again, don't forget we're going to have the midterm on chapters 1 through 7 next week. I'm going to fix this right now because homework 6 is not due next week. Lab 2 is due in 2 weeks. Lab 3 will be assigned, and then we get into a lot of homeworks. So I'm going to be making a new homework 5, I believe. I'm going to do that for Mimikatz, and that's going to pop up here shortly. So next week we're going to have the midterm and probably a really quick down and dirty homework 4 that I'll put together. So with nothing else to say, when we start into week 9, we're also going to get into lab 4, which is the wireless attack lab. So if you have not gotten your wireless adapters, you need to have them here very, very, very shortly. Okay, so that said, have a great week. Study hard for the midterm coming up, and we will see you around. This is Professor Brown signing off.